Well, thank you very much. I also enjoyed the first evening we met these guys. I do remember bad jokes. I don't remember that many of them were mine. But in a similar way, actually, we came away having just arrived in Oxford and not really sure why or why God had called us here. Just being a bit like, where are we meant to be in every area of life? Like, where are we meant to be working? Where are we meant to be making friends and building community? Where are we meant to be in church? And we had got a whole list of things that we were praying about and thinking about. And through the conversation with these guys, it was like they'd seen the list and they just said all these things that just really spoke to stuff that we were wrestling with God with. And so it's just a brilliant evening. And so I feel it's a real privilege to be here tonight, so thank you so much for inviting us. I mean, I guess most of you didn't get a say in that. So if this is a dreadful weekend, blame Al for his poor judgment. But I at least consider it a privilege to be here, and I'm really excited about what God's going to do. And actually, I think we sang everything that I was going to talk about tonight. So in one sense, I could just give up the floor now, but I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to just leap into the Bible and set up some thoughts that we'll probably unpack over the weekend as a whole. And you will hear from Helen tomorrow. No doubt you'll hear from Jesse at some point as well. Not scripted, but there we go. And I'll happily tell you a bit more of our story about how we got here, if you would like. But I don't want to tell you everything now because you have nothing to talk to me about. So, let's chat over breakfast or shooting bows and arrows or whatever we're going to do tomorrow. So this weekend we are looking at Romans chapter 12, which is a brilliant and challenging chapter. There's so much in this chapter. I'd originally planned that we would cover the whole of the chapter. We're now not going to do that. Partly because I really felt like I should dwell a bit more in the beginning of the chapter and also the really difficult stuff's at the end. So we'll leave that for another day. I'm no kidding. When I'm not, it really is. And actually ending the weekend on the wrath of God last thing on Sunday probably wouldn't set the right vibe. But I have spoken on those passages before, so if you want a cheerful podcast for your journey home, I can send you that. But we're going to look at Romans chapter 12. And Romans 12 comes after Romans 1 to 11, and that is just one of the many profound insights that I'm going to share with you this weekend. So I thought it would help just to start by giving you a bit of context about Romans leading up to this chapter, and then I want to unpack one idea that Paul talks about in the first verse of Romans 12, and then we'll press on through it further tomorrow and Sunday. So a bit of background. Romans was written by the Apostle Paul, written to a church in Rome, probably around 57 AD, written when Paul was in Corinth. And he had hoped to travel to Rome and then on to Spain once he had been to Jerusalem to deliver this offering money that he had collected. Now, this was not a church that Paul had founded, but he did have strong connections there. Scholars estimate there were probably about 200 people meeting in this church in at least 5 different locations across the city of Rome. And in chapter 16, Paul lists all these people. He mentions 27 of them by name. So even though he definitely didn't found this church, he seemed to know them and care about them intimately. And what's interesting is when you look through the list of names that he cites, and of course that's only like 10% of the church, it's quite a diverse bunch. You have Greek names, you have Latin names, you have Jewish names, which shows that ethnically this was a diverse group of people all fitting together into one church. But not only that, socioeconomically they were a diverse group as well. So we can tell from some of the names that people were of wealthy status and some of low status. So Aristobulus, for example, people think that he may actually have been the grandson of Herod the Great, so coming from a royal background. The majority of them were probably poor, regular labourers, and actually some of the names, scholars tell us, are actually names typically owned by slave classes in Roman society. So you have a church that is incredibly diverse. Ethnically diverse, diverse in terms of their socioeconomic background, but also diverse in their religious background as well. This group was made up of a mixture of Jewish believers in Jesus and Gentile believers in Jesus. So that is people who were Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and people who had come from other religious backgrounds or non-religious backgrounds but had come to believe in Jesus. And in Acts chapter 18, you can read a bit about this church and how it came together. It was a diverse group, but then in 49 AD, the Jews were expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius, and then 5 years later, allowed back again. And in those 5 years, everything changed in the church. So when they left, it was a largely Jewish church, And when they came back, they found that suddenly it had become more of a Gentile-flavoured church, which caused all sorts of questions about, well, how are we meant to practice our faith? Because it looks so different. It raised all sorts of questions about how Jews and Gentiles were meant to fit together. Did the gospel apply to both groups in the same way? And what do you do with things like sacrifices or circumcision or Sabbath or food laws? And so there were all these tensions, and so rather than actually being a beautiful thing, the diversity did cause some difficulties in the community. And one of the primary reasons that Paul writes this letter to the Romans is to sort that out. Now, actually, what's interesting is it's not until about chapter 14 that he really starts getting into the nitty-gritty of the particular things that they were wrestling with. But right up to that point, he is exploring the gospel. The reason being that Paul wants to make it really clear that we are all one in Jesus Christ. And so he spends arguably chapters 1 to 11 just laying out the glorious gospel of Jesus, such that when he goes in 12 to 16, he is then starting to apply that, having already established the sense that, of course, we're meant to be one. Of course, we're meant to be getting on together because we are all beneficiaries of the same gospel. And the letter has about 4 main movements, which I'll just sort of throw out there. We won't dwell on this too much. But essentially, chapters 1 to 4 say that the gospel reveals God's righteousness and creates a new humanity, chapters 5 to 8, which fulfills God's promises to Israel in the Old Testament, and then unifies the church. And it gets really practical. And it's here, chapter 12, that we are going to camp out for this weekend. Actually, we'll skip over the next slide. So having marvelled at, whenever you skip a slide, everyone's like, what's on that slide? Yeah, it was a good one. You like that one, do you? Okay, well, essentially, so one of my colleagues and friends, a guy called Dr. Andrew Ollerton, has just been working on a book on Romans, which I've had the privilege of reading, and a course as well. And this is one of his ways of explaining it. But buy the book when it's out. You don't need to know that. I'll tell you all the best bits. But it's a great way of understanding Romans. But anyway, we'll move on for the moment. So chapter 12, where we are going to be this weekend, Paul has celebrated the gospel, and now he says, okay, so let's apply this to our lives. And so 12 verse 1 says, therefore, so he's following on from the whole argument he's made up to this point. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, and here he's referring back to everything he's talked about in chapters 1 to 11, in view of the gospel, and what you know of the good news of Jesus Christ. Everything he's unpacked before. What's our response? He says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to the Lord, or to God rather. This is your true and proper worship. That's where I want to focus this evening. And actually Al in his prayer and these guys with their worship, they've already taken us there. This is a moment for devoting ourselves to God in true worship. So let's unpack a little bit about what Paul means. And I want to focus in on this idea of being living sacrifices. So Paul says we are to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I wonder what comes to mind for you when you think of worship. If you had to describe it, actually if you had to describe it not using words and just drawing it, I wonder how you would depict it. If you do a Google image search for worship, this is what comes up. I literally did this yesterday. These are all pictures of worship. They're all hands in airs, in the air, lights. I mean, some of them black and white, just to be a bit moody. Skinny jeans with acoustic guitars, and various. It's all very slick, isn't it? Like this is, this is. I'm just jealous because I can't pull off skinny jeans.
You're talking about us being on point. You're on point.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, but here, this is what we think of when worship, and you fit it perfectly. Like this is what comes to mind when you imagine it. It's kind of this corporate thing. It's all to do with singing, and this is very slick, and it's all very well lit, and that's typically how people think of it. The odd smoke machine, maybe, and I think that's fascinating. There's loads we could say about that, but anyway, for modern Christians, we tend to associate worship with singing, often singing in a crowd, and often for a time of worship, or a worship set, or something like that. We think of it as a fixed period where we do that in sort of moodily lit rooms. But that isn't what would have come to mind if you'd asked one of the early Christians, what do you think of worship? I think if they Googled it, it would have come out slightly different. What strikes me about these images is how clean they are and how free from blood they are. Because if you had asked a Jewish believer or an early Christian from a Gentile background, what do you think worship is? I think sacrifice would have been one of the key things that they would have thought of. Yes, they sang, yes, they raised their hands, and they did all these things as well, but actually they brought sacrifice as a core part of their worship in a way that we don't today. If you read Leviticus 6-7, which I'm sure are your favourite go-to passages, then you'll find out all sorts of stuff about sacrifices. People had to bring sacrifices to receive forgiveness from God, but there were all sorts of other reasons why you bring sacrifices as well. We'll look at some in a moment. As worship, you would bring various animals and grain and other things as well, but mainly animals, and you would sacrifice them as part of your communal worship. And by the time of Jesus, the whole way of doing sacrifice, particularly in the temple, had become really quite intricate. So people needed to bring a perfect animal for sacrifice. And so you might spend all your time like rearing this perfect animal at home, but actually loads of people didn't dare take the perfect animal on the journey, because what if it got damaged along the way? It wouldn't be suitable for sacrifice. So actually what most people did was they raised these animals, and then they sold the animals, and they took the money to the temple to buy a perfect animal. But actually, there was a particular coin that you could use in the temple, which wasn't necessarily the coins they had, so they had to pay a tax, and they had to exchange the coins so that they could pay in the right money, so they could buy the right animal, so they could then present it to the priest, and the priest would take it and bless it and do all these things, and then he would slaughter the animal on their behalf. And some of that was visible, some of that was not visible. And then the priest would do all sorts of different bits with the bits of the animal and the blood of the animal. And some of that you could see, pretty much all of it you could smell, I imagine. Because you are in a hot country, in a hot building. And so the blood in the air, yeah, it's pretty horrible. I won't dwell on this. But it was an unpleasant, gruesome experience. But that was how they thought of as worship. If you asked them to Google it, they wouldn't have got skinny jeans, acoustic guitars. They probably would have heard something, unless they put Safe Search on, something like that. So think how radical it is when Jesus turns up and everything changes. Because the early Christians believed that actually Jesus took the place of that whole sacrificial system. There was something about his death and resurrection that meant that whole system was done away with, at least for those who believed in him. Actually, it wasn't just Jews that were used to sacrifice. Gentiles saw that as part of their worship as well. If you walked around Rome, you would find all sorts of temples that were filled with animal sacrifices to various different gods. And actually, they had this whole system where then butchers would take the meat and they would sell it in the markets, which is why actually Paul talks in Romans a little bit and in 1 Corinthians about whether it's okay to eat that food or not, given it's been sacrificed to another god. But that's another topic for you to ask out about over breakfast tomorrow. But my point is, for pretty much everyone in the ancient world, you associated the idea of sacrifice with worship until Jesus. Because as Paul says in Romans 3, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood. Jesus came to do what the whole sacrificial system had been about. And because people believed he had so completed that, within a couple of years, Christians and Jewish believers entirely stopped sacrificing animals. And then the whole thing stopped in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. Think how radical a change that is. You were used to your entire life, a core part of your worship being bringing this sacrifice. And then one day everything changes. And you're getting the kids ready to go to temple. And they're like, are we bringing the goat? You're like, no, we don't need the goat anymore. And the goat's like, phew. You'd be well annoyed if you just bulk bought pigeons, wouldn't you? And you're like, but Jesus, you've come and what am I going to do with those now? Because sacrifice is no longer required. It completely changes the way you think about worship. It's incredibly radical. So then it's a little bit surprising when Paul suddenly takes this now obsolete idea of sacrifice and applies it to Christians. But actually what he does is he changes it. He puts it through a Christian lens, and he says, I think, 5 things about sacrifice here which were completely unheard of before and are really challenging. And I want to just present those to us quickly as a call for how we are meant to give ourselves in worship over this weekend and over our lives. So 5 ways that Paul reworks the idea of sacrifice through a Christian lens. Firstly, I think he argues that true worship is not given to receive mercy, but in response to mercy. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's important to understand that there are actually 2 main types of sacrifice in the Old Testament. There were what were known as sin offerings and burnt offerings. Again, you can read Leviticus for more on this. Sin offerings, as the name suggests, were given by someone to atone for, to pay for their sin, so that the worshipper could receive mercy and forgiveness. And when the animal was killed, different things were done with the animal. Part of its blood was sprinkled, some of its body was taken outside the camp to be burnt, some of it was eaten by the priests, and only select parts were put on the altar and given over to God. It was an intricate system. That's one type of sacrifice. The other type of sacrifice was what was known as burnt offerings. And these were given as an act not of atoning for sin, but of devotion, of worship, of gratitude. And unlike the others, where sort of bits were taken to different places, with these offerings, all of them were burnt up and given entirely to God. No priest got to eat any of those offerings. They were entirely devoted to him. Now, when Paul tells us to give ourselves as sacrifices, it's important to know which sacrifice does he have in mind. And I think it's clear he means burnt offerings. That's the model for how we are to give ourselves as worship. And the reason for that is because sin offerings were given to receive mercy, but burnt offerings were given in response to mercy. So look at what Paul says. He says, therefore, in the light of everything he's learned about the gospel, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, or in other words, in response to God's mercy. So nothing about our worship is in order to earn mercy from God. That's been given freely by Jesus Christ. Everything we do in worship is a response to his goodness. I think that's really important to understand, because if you think that worship is about pleasing God, as if he wouldn't be pleased already, then maybe you've got the wrong idea. It's about coming and enjoying being in the presence of the God who's already pleased with you, because he has shown you mercy through Jesus Christ. And our offering is not in order to receive fresh mercy from him. It's in order to respond to the mercy he has already shown. In the same way that a burnt offering was entirely consumed by God, so Paul is telling us that we are to present ourselves to him fully. He says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to the Lord. And if you've read the book of Leviticus, that phrase, actually, holy and pleasing, it comes up time and again in Leviticus, actually 16 times. It talks about an aroma that is holy and pleasing. And of the 16 times, 15 of them are about burnt offerings. Only one is about a sin offering. Why do you think that is? I think it's because a sin offering is something we owe God. It doesn't really bring him pleasure, it's a necessity. But when we bring our devotion, when we bring our worship, that actually brings pleasure to him. I'm glad my daughter's not in for this, actually. But I broke one of her toys the other week. And she knows now, actually. This is the point of the illustration. But I broke it, and I just felt bad, like it was a mistake. And so I thought, I need to buy her a replacement. So I bought her a replacement. And, of course, when I gave it to her, she said, oh, thank you. And then she went off and played with it. And it was, like, understated. But that was appropriate. Why? Because that wasn't a gift. Like, I had wronged her, and I had made amends. So it was okay that she just sort of said thank you. But if I'd given it to her as a gift, I'm sure her face would have lit up and she just would have poured out her gratitude. Well, she's 6, so she might not have done. But like in theory, the way you respond to a gift is totally different to the way you respond to something you're owed, right? And so when we give a sin offering to God, he accepts it. When we give a burnt offering to God, it brings him pleasure. Think about that. Your worship, your life brings God pleasure. Brings a smile to his face. I think that's an incredible, beautiful idea. A gift freely given as an expression of love brings a smile to the face of one who receives it. We please God greatly. Secondly, true worship is not about bringing a sacrifice, actually, but being a sacrifice. See, Paul says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Up to this point, people would offer the bodies of others, namely pigeons and goats. Actually, this ups the stakes a little bit. Paul says God isn't just after the things that you bring, things that are external to yourself, things you can buy from a market or own. He's after you. He wants you. Again, I think that's just a radical idea. God is not just after us for the things that we can do for him or the things that we can bring to him. He's after you. And you. Not just your possessions, not just your skills, not just your time, not just your energy, but you, made in his image, you can bring him pleasure. When we give our lives to God, every bit of us, it brings pleasure to his name. It's like an aroma that rises to the heavens and brings a smile to his face. Third, are you still with me? Yeah. Good. Third, true worship is not about a time of worship. It's about a life of worship. We often talk about a time of worship. We're going to enter into a time of worship now. We're going to finish the worship and go to the notices, or we have a worship set, or just as if it's a fixed, bounded time. No. Paul says we are to be living sacrifices. That is, all of our lives are meant to be given out as an act of worship to God. Part of the point is, I think, in saying that we're living sacrifices, is that we simply don't have to die. Why? Because Jesus has died in our place and risen again. And so actually, our lives are characterized by resurrection life. And Paul talks about that in Romans 6. But I think part of what he's saying in calling us living sacrifices is that the whole of our lives, all the time we are living, we are to live as sacrifices. Not just for 30 minutes on a Sunday or a few blocks of 30 minutes over an intense weekend like this. Like the whole of our lives are given over to worship, which actually, put the other way, means that the whole of our lives are opportunities for us to engage with God. And the whole of our lives are opportunities for us to lift an aroma that is pleasing to him. Wherever you find yourself, you can be there as a living sacrifice, pouring out your worship to him. When you walk into your workplace, you're not just there to serve your boss, you're there as a living sacrifice to the Lord of all, which affects the way that we work, the way we interact with others, the way we think about our integrity and our character. And I think when we live in our workplaces as ones not devoted to our boss, but actually pouring out our lives for the Lord of all, that aroma, I think it becomes noticeable to others around it. They might not know what it is, but they recognize there's something different about the way we are living. In our workplaces, we can encounter the pleasure of God by living as sacrifices. On the school run, when you're bumping into other mums, we can be the aroma of God by pouring out our lives as living sacrifices, and we can encounter his presence. When you're at home doing the food shop, or you're working out your finances, or whatever you're doing, you can encounter God. Why? Because there's no realm of life in which we cannot pour out ourselves in worship to him. When we live with this conscious awareness that all of our life is worship, actually it gives us moments where we can just be surprised to recognize, oh, God is in this place. I was walking to school the other day, taking my daughter to school, and I dropped her off and I was feeling a bit grumpy actually, and I was walking back and I started praying, and suddenly I just felt the Holy Spirit, just out of nowhere in a little grubby alleyway, and I just felt the presence of God. Oh yeah, there's no reason why I can't encounter God everywhere. Why? Because all of my life is worship. And when you worship him, wherever you are, it's an aroma that's pleasing to him. And he pours out his Spirit on us. I was listening to a worship album the other day, and there was this spontaneous track on it, and it said, "In everything, the little things," said the backing singer, hence it's in brackets. "Dishes piled high in the kitchen sink, let it be worship. You meet me in the ordinary." I heard that, I thought, really? Dishes piled high in the kitchen sink? Why not? If we are living our whole lives as worship, we can encounter him everywhere. We can encounter him in the chores. We can encounter him in the workplace. We can give all of ourselves to him and experience his pleasure. I like the way that Eugene Peterson translates this verse in the Message. He says, "Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering." Isn't that great? Fourthly, we're coming into land. True worship is not actually just about our souls, it's about our bodies. Paul says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. And that was actually an incredibly radical thing for him to say, particularly to the Romans. Because in Greek and Roman culture, the body was typically seen as a negative thing. It was seen as bad. The soul, that was the good part. That was the bit that God was interested in. But the body was considered dirty or negative. So Plato considered the body to be a prison cell for the spirit. Seneca, who was actually a Roman philosopher, he was a tutor to Emperor Nero and was writing literally at the same time as Paul, so influencing Roman philosophy at this very point. He famously said, "You are a little soul burdened with a corpse." And I think that actually sums up the way people thought about the difference between the soul and the body. This was how Roman people thought. So when Paul says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, they would have been like, no. God's not interested in our bodies. He's only interested in our souls. But Paul turns that on its head. Why? Because he understands that every part of us, every part of our physicality has the potential to please God. And if you go back through Romans, you find that Paul actually talks about the body a lot before this point. Almost always negatively. I won't go through now, but go back through Romans and you'll find that Paul talks about how we sin against God with our hearts, our minds, our tongues, our hands, our unmentionable parts. And someone steeped in Roman philosophy might go, well, yes, of course, because our bodies are fundamentally evil. But Paul says, no, something has changed in the gospel. So he says in Romans 6, don't offer any part of yourself as a sin, to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. Offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. Paul understands that every part of our bodies, our tongues, the things we say, our eyes, the things we look at, our feet that take us to particular places, our hands, the things that we do with our time, all of our physicality has the potential, just as it has to sin, it has the potential to bring glory to God. True worship is embodied in practical, physical ways. We need to resist the idea that worship is just spiritual. It's spiritual, but it's so much more than that as well. We can worship God everywhere with every part of us. And finally, just building on that, true worship is not just personal, but it's communal. That is, it's not just about me and Jesus. It's about me and Jesus in the context of us and Jesus. You kind of got that through those pictures, right? Most of those pictures, apart from one man like kneeling on a mountain, most of them were in a room. But actually, often the way we do worship is in a room with the volume up so that you basically don't hear people as much as possible. So it's just me and Jesus. Actually, true worship is where we care about and we're aware of everyone else around us. Because worship, even though we are pouring out our lives before God, also involves us pouring out our lives before others. In verse 10, Paul says this, be devoted to one another in love, which is quite an interesting idea, given that the whole thing about the burnt offering was that it wasn't devoted to anyone else, only to God. But for Paul, he understands that true devotion to God, I get the hint, I'll wrap up, no I'm kidding. He understands that true devotion to God looks like devotion to others. Oh, great. Welcome. I'll go back to point one. No, I'm kidding. I won't. Someone else can. What does true devotion to God look like? It looks like devotion to one another. So Paul starts off by saying, give your lives to God as living sacrifices. The whole of the rest of Romans 12 is all about how we treat each other as an expression of our devotion to God. If you go through the rest of Romans 12, and we'll pick up some of this over the weekend, true worship affects how we think about ourselves and each other. How we use our gifts to serve one another, how we share with those in need, how we practice hospitality, how we rejoice and mourn together. Honoring one another literally with our laughter and our tears. Isn't that beautiful? It affects how we feed our enemy, how we quench their thirst. And that's just chapter 12. We could go on. My point is, true devotion to God looks like giving ourselves to others. And that shouldn't really be a surprise. Because what do we see modeled in Jesus? We see someone who is perfectly willing to lay down his life for others because he was completely committed to his Father. That's what true worship looks like. I was reminded recently of a book by a guy called Rodney Stark, who was a sociologist who actually died this summer. I read this book years ago. He writes this fascinating study about the rise of Christianity and what was it that caused Christianity to spread like wildfire throughout the ancient world. And it was actually quite interesting reading it again recently because he says that one of the key things was pandemics, which obviously I read with a new light this time compared to last time I read the book. But he said this, in 260 AD there was a great epidemic that took the lives of many. And a guy called Dionysius of Alexandria wrote about how many of the unreligious people, particularly the wealthy and those with high social standing, how they responded. He says this. Push that to the side, don't feel free. That's fine. No, don't worry. He says this. At the first onset of the disease, this is the wealthy, non-religious he's talking about, they pushed the sufferers away and they fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treating unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. You're probably thinking, what on earth have I come into right now? This is cheerful, right? Great. So this is how people often in society responded when this disease spread in 260 AD. In contrast, he said, Christians lived completely the opposite. Inspired by the teachings of Jesus and the call to lay down our lives, they stayed in the cities when others fled. He writes this, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbours and cheerfully accepting their pains. In one sense, it's a gruesome image, but I think it's actually quite powerful. What Rodney Stark is saying is, and many other early historians point out, that there was this impulse that Christians had that was so different from the rest of society. And it was an impulse to lay down their lives for others. When others were treating bodies, even the bodies of their loved ones, like a threat, get rid of them, get away from them, treat them like dirt, Christians say, I'm going to lay down my body for you. They drew close to the bodies of others. Why? Because they understood that true devotion to God looks like devoting yourself to others. And the contrast between them was so stark that it meant that many people saw the way the Christians acted and thought there's something different about them. Even if I don't know why they act that particular way, there's something unique about them. And it was part of that that caused Christianity to spread like wildfire, because people recognize these are people who know what it is to offer their bodies as living sacrifices. This is true and proper worship. So Paul says this, I urge you, brothers and sisters, and with this we close. And do we have time for a worship song? Yeah. In fact, you may want, I'll give you back your lecture now. Paul says this, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So much tied up in that simple sentence. It's deeply challenging. But I wanted to start here, and actually I was going to cover loads of verses, but I just really felt like I should just stop here on this one verse tonight, because I think this actually symbolizes something of what this whole weekend, I feel, is going to be about. And as I've thought about this whole weekend, the one phrase, or the one word rather, that I've had in my mind the whole time has been this word recommitment. And I feel like, I don't know you well, I know bits about you as a church, bits of your story, but I feel like we're in a season where God is calling you to recommitment. And I think that's first and foremost recommitment to Him, but recommitment to Him looks like recommitment to one another as well. And also recommitment to the mission He has called you on. And so what I want us to do is simply start out by laying out our intent to Him and saying, God, I want to give myself to you fully tonight. And I don't know what it is for you. I want to give you a moment actually just to think and just express to God how you are feeling. It may be that one of those 5 points particularly stuck out to you, or maybe all 5 of them did, or nothing I said has made any difference, and that's fine. If God's saying something else, that's okay. Go with His 6th point. It was probably better than mine anyway. But I just want to give you a moment to say, God, I'm here for you. We've said it already, we've sung it already, but just take a moment in your heart to say, Lord, I'm here for you. I'm here to recommit myself to you. I want to devote myself to you fully. And as we go through this weekend, some of it will be practical, some of it will be more to do with the way that we think, the way that we worship, the way we engage with God. But the whole of it is worship. The whole of it is an opportunity to lay our lives down before God. And as we do, I believe that this aroma rises to Him and He smiles over us. So right now, Lord Jesus, we invite you to come. And we offer our lives before you. Not just the things that we have, but everything that we are. We give ourselves to you. We lay ourselves before you, not in order to receive mercy or to earn anything from you, but in response to all that you have done. We are so grateful for the gospel. We are so grateful that you have filled us with your Spirit, that you call us children of God. And so this weekend, we choose to recommit ourselves firstly to you, and as a result to one another and back to the mission that you have commissioned us to do. Come, Holy Spirit. We're going to worship. I don't know how you're feeling at the start of this weekend. Maybe you're here with high hopes, great expectations for the weekend. Maybe you're feeling exhausted. Maybe both of those things are true. Let's just use this as a moment to enjoy God's presence, to invite him to speak to us, and to pour out our praise to him. Let's worship. You may want to stand, you may want to kneel, sit, whatever you want to do. This is a moment for us all just to engage with God.